Hello. Hi. How are you doing? I'm not usually on camera like this. This is me trying something a little bit new, a little bit fancy. But it's been a while and I'm back. And if you know me, or if you've followed this channel at all, or my letterboxd, or just know my movie opinions in general, then you know one thing is true. I really love Martin Scorsese movies. And I know that's like, yeah, everybody loves Scorsese movies, whatever, but he's one of the directors that's really connected to me on a personal level, not just, ooh, fancy, flashy film. He doesn't like the MCU, whatever. I don't really care. I like his movies. They've meant a lot to me and are part of what have gotten me so into movies. So I was sitting around and I was kind of falling behind. I've been super busy schedule wise, and I was sitting around thinking, man, I really want to put out a new video. What am I going to do a new video on? And then I was also thinking a separate time, man, I really want to do a new ranking video. And then I was also thinking a separate time, man, I gotta watch more Scorsese movies. So I combined all of these ideas into what you are now watching, which is going to be a Scorsese ranked video. I'm going to rank all 25 narrative feature films from Mr. Martin Scorsese, and I'm being very awkward with my hands. I'm moving them a lot. Again, I'm not used to being on camera like this. But that is not including New York Stories. I didn't really want to watch it. He only did a small segment, and I heard it was bad. Not his segment, but the whole thing. And I'd already watched a bunch of kind of bad Scorsese movies. I was going through all of the bad ones, and I was just like, I don't want to watch New York Stories. So if you're a big New York Stories fan, I'm sorry, but let's get into the ranking. So the way this ranking is going to work is going to be very similar to any of my other rankings if you've seen them, but with one slight variation. I'm still going to be doing 3 tiers. I really like doing 3 tiers. This time, because there are so many fantastic Scorsese movies in my opinion, they're going to be a little unbalanced. There's going to be 5 in the first tier, which is going to be bad to good. And then the second tier is going to have 10, and that's going to be good to great. And the third tier is also going to have 10, and that's going to be great to fantastic. You can kind of get from even the tiers of these how I feel about most Scorsese movies. But let's get into it. I'm really excited to talk about a lot of movies that I really love. And starting us off at number 25, the worst of the worst, we have Boxcar Bertha, 1972, Scorsese's second feature film. The film follows Boxcar Bertha herself as she and a group of her lovers and friends mess around on the railway and accidentally become criminals and get caught up in a union fight against the railway and go to jail a couple times and kill a couple of people, and it's kind of a confusing plot to follow, or at least to describe. This is the film that notoriously led friend of Scorsese and fellow filmmaker at the time, John Cassavetes, to essentially tell Marty to get his act together because this movie was so below what he knew he could be doing with his career. And yeah, John got him with that one. It's definitely not the worst film I've ever seen, it's far from it, and you can certainly see a lot of the skill and subtext and symbolism that would go on to make Scorsese's career what it is. But really, this film just doesn't have it all together, and it's so unsettled that it feels like it's actually knocking at your door. But beyond not really having the tact and thoughtfulness of Scorsese's later work, I mean, this was his second film, give him some slack, its far bigger offense is that it's just not all that fun or engaging to watch. Every single character feels like something that just exists. I don't know really what any of them are like or what they really want. I mean, half of them accidentally get caught up into the main conflict. And, like, I know this is based on a true story, so that's just what happened, but it doesn't make for a compelling story. Scorsese would practically bank his later career on turning true stories and biographies into some of the most interesting movies you've ever seen, with a lot of real things to say about the people and the way they got into the situations, and what it says about humans, America, crime, religion, you name it, with these films. But this is just Boxcar Bertha. She hangs out. She can be resourceful and funny, which is sometimes nice, but the plot effectively has nothing to do with her as a person, and so it does fall all the way down to what I think is the worst Scorsese movie that I would probably never watch again. But hey, maybe that's not a bad thing, as it led Scorsese towards the path that he would thrive in later, and if this is the worst thing on your list, it's not the worst movies ever. I gave it a 2.5 out of 5. It's not very good. Coming in at number 24, I have... What? Who's that knocking at my door? So dumb. That's so dumb. 1967, Scorsese's first feature-length film. It still feels a little mean putting Scorsese's two first films as his bottom films, but I mean, you don't just spawn in creating masterpieces, or maybe you do if you're Charlotte Wells, but everyone's got to start somewhere. And in this instance, this film sets up a lot of the major stylistic and writing things that would stay true for Scorsese for almost all of his career. Also of note, this was also Harvey Keitel and Thelma Schoonmaker's first film, so I think that's really neat that all three of them got their start together. Especially for Thelma, that a true master of film editing, I seriously mean master. Scorsese films would not be what they are by any means without her. Got her start working on this. That's just cool to me. But this film follows Harvey's character, JR, a young up-and-coming gangster, talk about films and try to woo a nameless girl for an hour and a half, and also not believe her when she tells him that she's been sexually assaulted, and then him calling a whore over it, and then he whines about the fact that God won't let him have sex with every woman that he sees, and that women are too promiscuous and unholy because they all want to have sex. So, you know, if you can imagine, that's not super fun to watch. I fully believe this film also agrees that it's pretty rough to watch and that JR is the worst and annoying and a man-child, and I think it's actually pretty smart with that and what it has to say about faith and religion and how it's exploited to make the worst people in the world feel like perpetual victims of the world's ways. I think that's really neat. I think a lot of people start off on the wrong foot with this film, thinking that JR is supposed to be the supported character by the film's text, despite it showing you time and time again how awful and immature he is. Another big thing this film started for Scorsese, other than the big, religion theme, is the fact that we have a protagonist who is a terrible person. So many of Scorsese's movies, save for like a couple of them, follow awful people. It's kind of what he is comfortable writing about, and he does a really interesting job doing that. Even here, I think, it's just a lot rougher around the edges, and a lot of the flair is let out in the wrong places. You can tell these were a bunch of young filmmakers who didn't put too much thought into when would be best to use what effects or shots thematically, so you get stuff like a huge chunk of this film being JR fantasizing about wanting to have sex with every woman in existence, something that is supposed to be viewed as gross at best and downright evil given the rest of the character at worst, and Scorsese and crew are just like throwing every fun filming technique they could into it. There's a lot of weird use of slow motion, and the editing and tone just make the scene very confused as to what you're supposed to be thinking, and it's a big chunk of the movie, and a very important chunk of the movie. There are some super neat things that it does, cinematic parallels to the assault memory scene later, but all in all, it's just a muddled film. It feels more like a short film that was padded out or needed a few more drafts, because as is, it doesn't do that great of a job delivering the message I feel like it's going for, and it also feels like you're waiting for something to happen for most of the movie. At the end of the day, it's one that I would honestly never even suggest watching, especially being that you can just go watch its spiritual remake, Raging Bull, which is doing everything it's doing, but better and a little bit more watchable. I gave it a 3 out of 5. It's also kind of not very good, a little bit hard to get through. Coming in at number 23, we have New York, New York, 1977. One of Scorsese's first films. I don't feel like checking. This one's kind of rough, but also there's a lot to talk about with it. It follows Jimmy, played by Robert De Niro, and Francine, played by Liza Minnelli, as they go through a weird homage to 40s musicals paired with yet another story of an abusive and manipulative man and their weird and rocky relationship as they both rise to stardom. This movie is beautiful. I cannot deny it's honestly one of the best looking Scorsese movies in my personal opinion. They shot it on classical sound stages from 40s movies and tried to get a lot of the people from that era working on the production design and the backdrops and the overall look of the film, and it makes it super memorable and poppy. The likes really only The Aviator at parts even hits. Its score, soundtrack, and musical numbers are also incredible. The happy endings number at the end has to be a highlight of Scorsese's career, and in my opinion, it tops stuff like the dance scene at the end of An American in Paris. There are also some really great themes at play in this movie, and individual scenes that explore them. The relationship of power and fame and rising in Hollywood, the way being in love can blind you to negative and abusive and manipulative behavior, and how heartbreaking that can be to see that image of shiny golden Hollywood love to start to slip. Describing it like this makes it sound like a masterpiece, and indeed, I think there could have been a masterpiece in this movie. All the pieces were in place. The performances are amazing. The movie looks and sounds incredible. But there's really one big problem. This movie is an absolute nightmare of a slog to get through. It is the 7th longest film on this list, which doesn't sound bad until you look at how long all of those movies are. But its length wouldn't be a problem. I'm a big fan of long movies. If it actually felt like it was doing something for most of that runtime. Any given scene for about a third of the movie, they're at some random music venue or restaurant. Jimmy doesn't want to be there and looks miserable. Francine is trying to have a good time but is about to cry. Somebody comes in and there's this weird back and forth dialogue begins that I really hope I can find a good example of, because I can only describe it as New York, New York dialogue. It's harsh and cold and unhuman and almost humorous the way the conversation goes back and forth like it does.
What?
Nothing. I just thought it would be different. You know what I mean?
Different? It is different!
I know it's different.
Well, then what's the
It's not the
problem?
kind of different I
Well,
had in
what's the
mind.
problem?
The kind of different I had in mind was maybe sweet and calm and...
It is calm!
And ardent.
I'm sorry,
That's good.
it's just a little... It's...
And pretty, you know?
What?
Pretty.
It's pretty!
You can't say that.
It is
You
pretty.
can't
What
look.
is... What?
You can't say it's pretty.
I want to marry you! What are you talking about? Please, go inside. Go inside. This is private.
And the argument goes on until Francine does something that Jimmy doesn't like, and he gets angry. He maybe hits her or yells at her, and then the scene ends. And it just does that over and over and over again with no plot for about a third of the film. In fact, this film doesn't really have much of a plot to speak of at all. Yeah, it's kind of a love story, but that's not really a central driving force for the story itself that you see progress scene to scene. My brother and I watched this together, and we both really wanted to love it, but by hour 2 of almost non-stop arguments and no plot going anywhere, we felt like we were honestly losing our minds and just laughed in disbelief at why someone would write the movie like this. It's like the Abbott and Costello Who's on First bit, but an actual argument not played for comedy at all, because it's lorded over by a downright abusive, awful-to-watch man. I think the film really gets itself together by the end of the movie and has something really powerful and cool to say, but despite me loving so many aspects, this was downright hard to get through. It was really miserable, honestly, especially from Scorsese. And honestly, even more miserable than the other two below it, because at least those were really short. I don't think it's inherently bad. I think it's actually pretty good and has some good elements, but man, I just never want to see it again. I gave it a 3 out of 5. It's wild. If you haven't seen it, it is wild. At number 22, we have Mean Streets 1973, the film that switched Scorsese's path and put him towards Goodfellas. I don't know. It was a good film. It's better than these other films that I've been talking about. But hey, also, this isn't bad at all. Mean Streets, based loosely on Scorsese's actual environment he grew up in, follows Johnny Boy, played by Robert De Niro, and Charlie, played by Harvey Keitel, as they both try to rise up in the mob. It's angry and youthful and dumb and clumsy, and it's a really good time, honestly. Johnny Boy is reckless and constantly getting into fights and messing things up, and Charlie, the level-headed one, has to try with his life to keep him out of trouble through this really almost sweet portrayal of brotherhood that they have growing up on the same streets. It's like a rough, angry, but more refined style that Scorsese was going for in Who's That Knocking at My Door that would later get even more refined into something like Goodfellas. It's got great scenes and a great sense of dynamics between the characters, but I will say it's just not nearly memorable or as exciting as any of Scorsese's later works. I can barely recount the plot outside of vague Johnny gets in fights and stuff, and there's no real scene that stands out in my mind save for the one on the rooftop and the bar fight. So while this is the first one to not be like, ack, I don't ever want to see it again, it's just not quite to the same level as a lot of Scorsese's later work. Also, De Niro's hair in this is super bad. I felt so compelled to reach through the screen and just snip it off and also slap him. I gave it a 3.5 out of 5. This is the first one where we really get a taste of what Scorsese can and will be. And at number 21, we have Gangs of New York 2002. The first one not from pre-80s that I'm picking on, and the last one of our first tier, if that makes any sense. And this is a big step up from those other films, quite frankly. Gangs of New York, as you can imagine, follows some gangs in New York, specifically two gangs in the mid-18th century who fought for control of New York's territories, or the 5 Points. The leader of the little Top Hat gang, which is definitely its real name, is Bill the Butcher, played by the legendary Daniel Day-Lewis, and he killed the father of our young Irish DiCaprio. I don't feel like checking his real character name. DiCaprio, after being in hiding for a long time, comes back to try and get revenge on Bill and also rebuild the gang that his father used to run. This is such a cool and epic, kind of big movie. It's one of, if not the earliest set American crime history trademark movies from Scorsese, and you can see him having so much fun with the setting and the time period. It's muddy and gross and violent, and everyone's got like clubs and big cleavers and everything. It's super fun, especially Bill. He has just these massive cleavers, and he literally twirls his mustache, and he's got like the There Will Be Blood angry eyes going on, and it's just so fun. And also Cameron Diaz is a co-lead in this movie, and she's actually really good. I'm not usually a Cameron Diaz fan, but she kind of rocks in this. And really the whole thing is just fun. But I wrote in my review a while back when I first watched it, and I think the same thing now, that this is easily one of the most bloated and unfocused movies from Marty, next to like New York, New York. The characters and stakes and emotions are all great, but the plot yet again feels like it's kind of happening for no or pretty contrived reasons. Leo's big plan seems to come and go out of nowhere, and the way it fails is just as much out of nowhere, and the entire conclusion just feels weird and rushed. And the rise of the Irish gang, again, I don't feel like checking the name, just kind of happens, and you're like, oh, that's cool. Good to see the Irish are rising up. It just feels like a lot of the movie is spent laying stuff out, explaining locations, people, crime organizations, love interests, with a bunch of super and engaging and interesting scenes, but then it just does that for 2 hours and then all of a sudden it ends. The emotional core by the end of the movie just isn't there for me, which is a shame because this really is a standout, especially having Daniel Day-Lewis, who is incredible in this, and his final line remains super iconic. And although it ends up this low on the list, it's definitely one that I would probably rewatch any time. I gave it a 4 out of 5. And if we're finishing our first tier on a 4 out of 5, you can kind of see the direction this video is going, but hopefully it'll be interesting. Stick with me. Stick with me. At number 20, we have The Color of Money, our first good to great film from Scorsese. This is a very unique one from him. The Color of Money is, I guess, a legacy sequel to the hit 1961 movie The Hustler that follows the former titular hustler Fast Eddie, played by Paul Newman, as he gets back into the game by teaching Vincent, played by Tom Cruise, his ways. I'll start this off by saying I have never seen The Hustler, though I'm very curious to see it now because this movie is a little odd. It's really good, the performances are super engaging, especially young Tom Cruise bringing that energy that only young Tom Cruise has.
If it is just for bangers, everybody's doing it. Everybody's doing it. There's a lot of guys doing it.
It's got some fantastic direction, editing, and stylization where some of the pool scenes are simply crazy to watch. I like the pacing of the movie. I love the way it's structured, as it's the only sports movie I've ever seen where it gets down to the final match and I really didn't know who to root for. I kind of wanted Tom Cruise to win a little bit. I kind of wanted Paul Newman to win a little bit. And that conclusion is just kind of an interesting thing to me. I think that's where the movie kind of loses me a bit, and I feel like I've missed something. The first half is focused on Eddie teaching Vincent a lot of his ways along with his girlfriend and kind of using Vincent, and you really kind of get a sense that you feel bad for Vincent. He is this really kind of full of himself, a little bit of a jerk, but really good pool player who seems to be a decent guy, who is now getting used by his girlfriend and Eddie to like make money and con people. And that's kind of the vibe you get for the first half of the movie. But then the second half of the movie, Vincent and Eddie have this big fallout, and now you mostly follow Eddie as he's like, oh, now I'm going to reclaim my title as the Hustler 1961, and he kind of goes back in and himself gets kind of really interesting and engaging to watch as a character grow throughout the movie, and then you're kind of rooting for him, and it's really interesting. It just didn't click for me by the end because I didn't really see how their arcs came together fully. It made it feel a little flimsy, especially in Vincent's department, because he was the one I really loved in the first half of the film, being a goofy, loud idiot and seeing him completely destroy people at pool. But then his character kind of drops out of the movie for the conclusion, and it just doesn't feel like the kind of conclusion you'd write to the movie if the first one didn't exist. Like, maybe that's crazy. Maybe if I'd seen the first movie, like The Hustler, I would feel the same way. But this feels like a finishing character arc for Eddie from the first movie, not actually for this. And he's the one who gets kind of a complete arc. Vincent's arc kind of ends midway through when he just becomes the idiot hustler. So it became kind of underwhelming despite this movie being really cool. Who knows, maybe after I watch The Hustler I'll like it more. Maybe I have no taste. But I thought it was pretty cool. I also gave it a 4 out of 5. At number 19, Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, 1974. A very, very interesting movie. This is kind of one of the weirder ones. One of the ones I got to later, but it's really, really interesting. Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore follows Alice, played by Ellen Burstyn, and her son Tommy as they try and recoup after the death of Alice's abusive husband. It's a pretty simple story as she road trips across the country, stopping at different towns, trying to get the money to get all the way to California as she struggles to find work and to be treated fairly and desperately looks for a new and real connection of love in a world full of men just like her husband. Its stakes are some of the theoretically lowest of this entire list, or at least the most domestic. It's no gangster film filled with death or the seedy, violent nature of a boxer. It's about a mom just trying to get through. But with that, its stakes become some of the most gripping and personally powerful. When Mr. Gangster Man starts to get shot at or chased by the cops, you expect it. Or when Taxi Driver Guy almost dies, you expect it. And with half of the time, you're like, they kind of had it coming. But with Alice, she's been a victim her entire marriage, and now if she can't navigate and compromise and make the new life work, there is no alternative. She has to do it. She has to take care of her kid, all while trying to keep herself sane and deal with the fact that everyone underestimates her and treats her like an object. It's a really engaging and powerful story and does an amazing job making you feel for Alice as a mother. The performances and the writing make the mother-son relationship feel so real in such tense situations, and you can understand some of the more questionable decisions Alice makes because of Tommy, or even to get some relief from Tommy. It's super down-to-earth feeling, and yet despite the plot just being that for the entire time, it never really feels slow or like nothing's happening. It has such a unique energy and vibe. I could probably read into all of the creative decisions a lot more, but as is, it feels like a really great movie with a lot of unique and interesting choices, and one of the best Scorsese protagonists, and an all-in-all really good time of a movie. It just doesn't fully connect with me like I want it to. I think the big reason for that is the romance stuff. Quite frankly, for as much as I love Marty, he really doesn't write women protagonists that often, and while on the whole I think Alice is great, she feels like a super in-depth and real character, and I love how he captures her as a mother. The romance stuff loses me a bit, and I feel like he doesn't quite understand why Alice keeps coming back to men like this. It doesn't really flesh out that part of her character. You can't intuit those things about her just from the subtext, and it feels like the least developed part of her that never fully clicks for me in the actual text. And I just didn't really like Chris Christopherson's character that much, or the way that the plot resolved, quite frankly. But what can you do? It's still an endlessly fascinating and engaging film to be in, especially during some of its stylistic flares. I gave it a 4 out of 5, doing like the Saul Goodman thing, you know? At number 18, we have Hugo, 2011, a very interesting one, and one of the few of these that I caught in theaters. Time to hop aboard the Hot Take Express. Toot toot, oh no, there's a boy on the track. It's young me, not liking this movie when I watched it in theaters. That's right, I know I'll at least get a couple of people disappointed in the fact that I have Hugo this low. So many people connect with it on such a personal level, but despite it seeming like something written specifically for me, I just never have. Hugo follows Hugo Cabret as he lives alone, orphaned in the clocks of a train station. as he steals stuff from vendors to survive and is trying to put together an automaton that his dad and him never finished fixing before he died. It's the only Scorsese movie that is an honest-to-God kids movie, and it's sweet and funny and has some really interesting stuff to do and say as Hugo dives into the mystery of Georges Méliès and his once expansive film career and what an artist's purpose is in life. It's got funny slapstick in Spectre Man, the girl from Diary of a Wimpy Kid that completely unexplained never comes back in any of the sequels, and it taps into that immense passion Scorsese has, not just for filmmakers, especially early filmmakers, but also film restoration and preservation, something that he has been one of the leading forces in for years. So yeah, it's cool. It's very cool. And it's one of the best looking films in Scorsese's 2010s digital era, on top of being his first and only film shot for 3D, which he uses to surprisingly good effect. And I can't really give too many complaints about its actual writing or performance or anything like that, but this is surprisingly one of the films that I feel connected to the least out of any Scorsese movie. I just don't think Hugo's character and the story arc ever really worked for me. I don't get emotionally invested in him, and it feels in some ways like he's just getting dragged along by the connection between him and Georges, which for the ending and really the entire point behind Hugo's plot to work, it needs to be really powerful and personal, and it just wasn't for me. It makes the pacing of the movie and the literal actual plot itself fall apart for me emotionally, despite really loving a lot of the settings and characters and set pieces. By the end, I'm like, wow, that sure is nice, I guess. My favorite stuff in the whole film is all the stuff revolving around Méliès's career. The flashbacks and recreations are incredible, and there's such a sense of wonder and love distilled into them that you can't help but also fall in love with this rough form of filmmaking. But it just never ties together in the end with all of its moving pieces for me. The gears don't all line up, you know? The whole Hugo's purpose is to fix things and to make everything fit in its place. It just doesn't really work for me. I don't get connected to that. I don't see that from Hugo's character. If you want to hear some more in-depth and rambly thoughts on this movie, you can check out the podcast me and my brother do, Recently Logged. We just did a whole episode on it, but as is, I respect this movie and love so much of what it's doing, but I never really fall in love with it myself. Though I did read the book after I first watched this movie in theaters, and it's pretty crazy and pretty good to memory. I gave it a 4 out of 5. At number 17, we have The Wolf of Wall Street 2013. A real interesting film. Looks like we're still on the Hot Take Express, and now headed to, oh, what's this? I think it's Wall Street. Where's that Patrick Bateman guy I've heard so much about? Or rather, haven't heard so much about. So let's get this out of the way. You've all heard of The Wolf of Wall Street. This is one of the most popular with mass audiences a Scorsese film has ever been, which is a bit questionable, but it's based on the story of one Jordan Belfort as he rises through the evil and messed up world of Wall Street and dives headfirst into its most harmful and downright awful tendencies, on top of illegally working in the stock market and ripping people off for millions of dollars. It follows his rise and his fall, and the way he slinked his way out of trouble and went on to continue selling his ideology to people even to this day. Which apparently now he's into NFTs and crypto, if that says anything about the legitimacy of either of those. The movie is a 3-hour trip into sex, drugs, business, conning, and violence, and it's easily the most disturbing and graphic of any of Scorsese's movies. And on one hand, that's for a really good reason. It is used to fantastic effect to show the evils of Wall Street plain and simple. It's disturbing and nightmarish, and makes the themes around Jordan's cult-like behaviors and personality, and the fact that he got let off with the lightest sentence imaginable, and sold everyone out, and then got out early to continue thriving after 3 hours of sickening debauchery. It makes for one of the most powerful, cold, hard, and eerie endings to any Scorsese movie. But at the same time, it really is just too much for me personally, especially being that a lot of it has such a light and comedic tone to kind of balance out the fact that this would be the most miserable movie in the world if it didn't have a slightly comedic tone. I straight up don't really want to watch this again. I'm not one to advocate for censorship in movies, like put whatever you want in your movie as long as it's not harming anyone, but that doesn't mean I personally enjoy watching all of that in movies. This was just a step too far for me in a lot of ways, and I wouldn't have made it all the way through probably if it wasn't for this video and the fact that I did want to see it all the way through at least once. But man, it's just hard to get through for me, especially in the portrayal of Margot Robbie's character, which she is amazing in. If this movie was just here to get Margot Robbie to break out into the industry and one day be in Barbie, then so be it. She is outstanding. But watching her character get treated this way in such a graphic depiction just makes me very much not want to watch it again, especially the sexual assault scene in the movie, which I didn't know was in it before I turned it on. Literally sickening, and I would very much appreciate it if people stopped talking about Margot Robbie like she's an object all the time on the internet, and especially posting the leg spread gif from this movie under every news piece about her. It's a big yikes, and yet again I will say that we need to treat celebrities like just normal people, because that's what they are, and this is really messed up to do to a person. But that's my Margot Robbie soapbox again. She's one of the most talented actresses working today, but yeah, this movie really isn't for me, but the performances and direction and writing are incredible and very notable among Marty's career. Like, it really is to some extent a masterpiece, even though I don't think it's perfect. Actually, the biggest thing that surprises me about this movie is the fact that it's so popular. It's super long, and honestly, among the long list of movies Scorsese has made, this feels like one of the worst paced. It actually drags at some point, and me and my girlfriend, who I watched this with, which, by the way, this was her first Scorsese movie, which wasn't a good introduction to my favorite director, but we both kind of got bored at parts during the middle, which compared to something like Goodfellas, or even what mass audiences are typically willing to sit through runtime-wise, it just surprises me. But yeah, definitely one of the most interesting Scorsese movies, period, for a number of reasons. It has some insanely memorable scenes. I gave it a 4 out of 5. Very weird 4 out of 5, but it's a 4 out of 5. At number 16, we have The Departed, 2006. The Departed, if you will. Now this one, I definitely get the mass appeal. This thing is goofy, fun, exciting, and has just enough subtext to make it really feel punchy while never sacrificing its very blockbuster feel. And hey, it actually won Oscars, which happens depressingly few times for Scorsese movies. The movie follows Billy, played by DiCaprio, along with Colin, played by Matt Damon, in what is easily the silliest plot of a Marty picture. You see, Billy comes from a rough crime family, but wants to turn that around and become a cop for the Boston PD. But at the same time, Colin gets under the wing of Frank Costello, played by Jack Nicholson, a notorious crime boss, who then sends Colin into the police academy at the same time as Billy to try and go undercover for the mob. Billy then can't get a normal job at the PD because of his family, so they put him undercover in the mob. And the movie follows this cat and mouse of Billy trying to get close to Frank and spying on them as Colin ranks up in the PD and spies on them. They even, in a continuingly goofy string of fate, end up falling in love with and dating the same girl. I think it's technically partially based on the Hong Kong film Infernal Affairs, which has practically the same premise, though The Departed would only get made 4 years later. but man, the performances and the much more lighthearted nature of this film make it so much fun. They're all doing Boston accents and pronouncing everything in the funniest ways possible.
Our target is a major transaction of microprocessors. Yes, those. I don't know what they are. You don't know what they are. Who gives a fuck? Cash.
And it's just a good time while still having very nice cinematography, editing, direction, and really strong themes. I feel like these are all a given with later Scorsese, so I'm not going to harp on the technical side of things too much. It's not my favorite, and I think it can drag in bits in the middle, but even if this was Marty's best, it's still pretty darn great. It's just so much fun and so memorable, and it's just good. Again, I could see why this one is such a hit with audiences and at the Oscars. I gave this a 4.5 out of 5. That means with 15 more to go, we are at 4.5 out of 5. We can only go up. We can only go up. At number 15, we have Cape Fear, 1991, one of the only horror movies from Martin Scorsese. It follows Sam Bowden, played by Nick Nolte, an attorney in a small town, as he and his family get terrorized by a former client of Sam's, Max Cady, played by, you guessed it, De Niro, who is a violent rapist who Sam hid documents from that could have got Max acquitted, but because Max was illiterate, he couldn't read them, so he did not know. He spends his time in prison learning how to read and reading a lot of the Bible, which I think the point of might have gone over his head a little bit, because now he's on the quest to destroy Sam and his whole family. It's not a traditional slasher film, but that's about the closest thing I could relate it to in the horror genre. He does sexually assault another person in town and murder a couple of people, but it's not serial and is more used to build up the tension of how Sam is going to actually keep his family safe and how they're going to catch Cady actually committing one of the crimes. So it has this very unique structure as Cady plays mind games with the family and messes with their house and their daughter until it culminates with them trying to run away on a boat and Cady following them into the storm. But apart from just the kind of unconventional horror structure of the movie, it also has a lot of interesting themes at play about domestic life and families, as well as religion and the way Cady uses and twists the Bible, even tying into his death, thinking he's ascending to heaven. But at the end of the day, it's the fact that it's such a simple, fun horror mystery with a lot of Scorsese's flair and fun performances that really elevate it this high on the list. It's memorable, not just for Marty's career, but also in horror movies in general, which I'm a pretty big fan of, and I've never really watched another horror movie that feels quite like this. It's got outstanding opening credits, very fun camera flares and set pieces, and it keeps just the right amount of sinister and dark to make it fun, even with its more intense themes, which I was worried about going into it. And really, De Niro's accent and everything just makes him such a memorable horror villain. I gave it, again, a 4.5 out of 5. At number 14, we have Bringing Out the Dead, 1999. I'm so excited to talk about this one. It's freaking Nicolas Cage in a Scorsese film with Paul Schrader. This movie is great. I don't know if this still counts as the Hot Take Express, but I'm so happy to talk about this one. I feel like no one talks about this freaking movie, and they should. It goes so hard, and it's so crazy. It feels like a 3 a.m. drug trip of masochist mayhem, and I mean that in the best possible way. It follows Frank, played by freaking Nicolas Cage. Nicolas Cage in a Scorsese movie. That's the best thing to happen since we had Nicolas Cage in a De Palma movie. Frank is a night shift paramedic in New York who has found the most addictive drug there is, saving people's lives. Oh yeah, and did I mention this is our first movie on the list written by freaking Paul Schrader, the best, worst guy you know? The film takes place over 48 hours of Frank's life as he tries to kick the sweaty, seedy life of the late shift. But yet, no matter what he tries, he keeps getting pulled further and further in as he starts to see the ghosts of the people he failed to save. This movie goes so freaking hard. It's gross and sweaty and trippy and intense and scary and fun. It's paced like a bullet, and it just has such a tangible sense of atmosphere that no matter what direction the story ends up heading with its outstanding supporting cast, you just want to watch more, no matter how graphic and gross it gets. You get pulled into the mind of Frank, just wanting more and more. And it may not be the strongest of the bunch, especially from the very sweaty underbelly of New York style movies from Scorsese and Schrader, but it's easily one of the most memorable from a stylistic standpoint and from a cast standpoint. The editing is incredible, and nobody fits the role in this kind of movie better than Cage and the continuing supporting cast. I mean, John Goodman is in this movie. It may not be the most well known, but this is my official notice saying go watch this movie. If the rest weren't even more fantastic, this would easily be one of my favorites off the list, and I would watch this any time. I gave it a 4.5 out of 5. This movie rocks. I'm saying this rocks. At number 13, The Irishman, 2019. A very interesting film, and the only Netflix original, so that says a lot. Scorsese is, he's getting a bit old, I think. It's funny just how much of a companion piece this could be to Goodfellas on a thematic level and really a pacing and story structure level as well. The Irishman follows Frank Sheeran, played by Robert De Niro, of course, who, by happenstance, gets in with mobster Russell Buffalino, played by Joe Pesci. And it follows how Frank's life gets changed forever by that meeting and the meeting of Jimmy Hoffa, played by Al Pacino, during the rise of organized crime and labor unions. It pretty much follows their lives in their entirety, and much like in Goodfellas, it doesn't end with Frank getting killed in a shootout or some other tragic means, but by getting old and living with his choices. Throughout the movie, even highlighting in an eerie light when and how each person that is introduced will die.
Oh no, he was just made the new boss of Philadelphia. He took care of everything from Philadelphia to Atlantic City. That I know.
It's a long and at some point tiresome film that examines the choices you make in life and how they shape you and your regrets as you get older. It's really freaking cool. There are some things I don't love about this movie, mainly the weird de-aging and how a lot of the performances suffer because of it, and the pacing. De-aging still hadn't been perfected here, and even in more recent movies like the new Indiana Jones, where the de-aging technically looks pretty seamless, it just sucks away the performance. No matter what they do, you can tell that Harrison Ford isn't this young, and because of that, he moves and sounds like old Harrison Ford, except for you lose a lot of the detail in his face. He looks flat and fake despite looking really good. This movie is no different. You never believe that De Niro is younger than 60 despite his weird smooth face, and for all of them it definitely strips something from their performances. Luckily, you can kind of get used to it just as fast as it starts to be less relied on and the characters age a bit, so it isn't a huge detractor, but it definitely pulls me out a bit every time I watch it. As for the pacing, it's pretty good for the most part, being one of the longest Scorsese movies in the bunch, clocking in at a cool 3.5 hours. It does a pretty incredible job of making this slow, meandery old man movie so interesting and exciting to watch unfold, but there are a couple entire subplots that feel pretty drawn out or boring. In fact, one of the biggest ones, which I wasn't expecting, was Al Pacino's. I just didn't like his character and felt like the weird politics of his section of the movie were just kind of boring and slow. I love Al, but it just wasn't for me, and it's the only part of the movie which I wish was a bit briefer and more honed in, as our main character kind of takes a back seat. But really, these problems aren't huge when I watch the movie, and honestly, there's something super endearing about this one. It feels the most thoughtful and willing to take its time out of any of the Scorsese mob movies. It feels not just like an examination of the people in the movie, but Scorsese's career itself and how his work influenced his life. The ending hit super hard for me, and I love it every time I go around and watch it. And it almost becomes kind of a comforting movie in a weird sense. It's pretty cool, actually. I gave it, again, a 4.5 out of 5. The Irishman, so good. Gotta get the Criterion sometime. At number 12, we have Casino, 1995. This movie is bright, it's bold, it's in your face personally, and it's super sick. Casino is actually in an extremely similar boat to The Irishman for me. This movie is absolutely epic. It's in your face and loud and bright and over the top and expensive. It's got a crazy as heck opening and opening credits, and I think about like 80% of this movie is just voiceover. This movie follows Sam, or Ace Rothstein, in another one of Scorsese's based on a true story American crime movies, as he, played by, of course, De Niro, and his friend Nicky Santoro, played by, of course, Joe Pesci, are sent by the Italian mob to get roots in the birth of Las Vegas. As Ace, a former gambler, takes over the Tangiers casino and runs it like a clock. Nicky gets caught up in the violence and money of Vegas and ends up becoming the mobster of the era, as Ace falls further into falling in love with and running his own casino, and falls in love with Ginger, a casino hustler played by Sharon Stone. It's really such a wild ride, and the fact that it pulls off, I think, the most amount of voiceover of any Scorsese movie is really impressive. And I almost love everything about it, especially aesthetically. Unfortunately, the one thing I really don't love about Casino makes me sound pretty bad, as it pretty much all revolves around the only female lead in the movie. Ginger just really annoys me in this movie, and it's not her performance. I like her performance, and I really like Sharon Stone. It's more the way her plot actually goes. The entire subplot of Ginger and her ex, especially Lester, and the kidnapping of their child, and so much of the drama of that just isn't my thing, and I find it pretty annoying to get through, and it takes up so much of the movie. And I know it's based on real life, so again, what are you gonna do? Not include one of the most interesting things that happened in this person's life? I mean, like, Ginger as a character, I think, has some really interesting conflicts and motivations, especially towards when she's first introduced at the time, but by the time we get through all the drama, we've just spent too long hearing the two of them argue and fight and be abusive to one another, and that's just not enjoyable for me to get through, and it takes such a big chunk of the movie. But seriously, outside of that, this movie is a total blast for me. And it's one of the more uniquely lit and edited movies in Marty's catalog, giving it such a great atmosphere and sheen. It's a shame that there's something I really just don't like watching in this movie, because I love casinos as settings for movies and mob movies with De Niro and Pesci, and it just screams for me to want to love it, and I love so much about it. It's got great sequences, again, the cinematography is some of the best out there, and I just can't get around some of my dislike for it that puts it this low. Of course, it's not even that low, so I don't even know what I'm talking about. Either way, De Niro's sunglasses alone put this on the top half of the ranking. I also gave Casino a 4.5 out of 5. At number 11, we have The Age of Innocence, 1993. This movie is magic. This is the first fantastic film on the list, and we're at number 11, which is crazy. The Age of Innocence follows Newland Archer in 19th century high society, played by, yet again, the one and only Daniel Day-Lewis, and his arranged fiancée, May Welland, played by Winona Ryder, as he falls in love with her cousin, who was previously married, Ellen Olenska, played by Michelle Pfeiffer. It's rich and over the top and beautiful, and there's great costumes, and it's such an immersive period piece. And if that doesn't sound like your cup of tea, then you're a fool. This is actually a really violent film in the most unique sense. It's easily the least actively violent of any Martin Scorsese film, but it's got such an underlying anger and violence towards its character drama and conflict and the society that it exists in. It makes it one of the most eloquently suffocating films I've ever seen. You feel like you're trapped as all these characters desperately just want to scream and go crazy, as even in one scene the use of color as the screen goes completely red, and yet they have this constant need to uphold the image of high society and manners. It's insane, and it's one of the most beautifully shot, costumed, designed, edited, and scored films on the list so far. The performances are amazing. Winona Ryder is tragically blissful in this movie, and really just having her at all in a Scorsese project is amazing, and they should work together again. And I mean, I've already talked about it, but Daniel Day-Lewis is outstanding as always, and Michelle Pfeiffer brings her A game. Despite me not being super in love with a lot of her other work, she holds up with Winona and Daniel easily. I feel like this movie gets a kind of bad rep among a lot of Scorsese fans, calling it boring or uninteresting or even just not quite their thing, but I quite frankly just can't see it. This is one of the first Scorsese films I really fell in love with. It just has such rich and eloquent dialogue that's so smartly thought out to weave through all of these unique character dynamics as they evolve scene to scene. I think the pacing is phenomenal. I think every scene in this movie is just practically perfect. This movie is not the most meaningful to me personally, but it is one of my go-tos if you said, what is a Scorsese movie I should watch? I gave it a 5 out of 5. That means the last one of tier good to great is a 5 out of 5. All of the rest, the final 10 films, are all 5 stars. I need help. At number 10, the first of our creme de la creme, our great to fantastic, we have Kundun, 1997. Now this one you may be thinking, oh, I haven't heard of this one. This is a mysterious one. Where's this one? The answer is it's gone. Kundun follows the real-life story of the 14th Dalai Lama's life, played by Tenzin Sarong. It follows him from birth as he gets discovered and grows up trying to understand his place among his religion and people, and most importantly, following his young adult life as the leader of the Tibetan people as communist China invaded and oppressed their people and religion, forcing him to flee to India, never to return. It's a touching and simple feeling, yet rather grand exploration of faith and how to stick to an ideology of peace and love in the shadow of such awful horrors of war. It was written by Melissa Matheson, who spoke personally with the Dalai Lama, asking him if she could make the movie, as well as interviewing him to work as the basis for their script. It's the only Scorsese film to be shot by the legendary Roger Deakins, and I genuinely think it might have some of the best of Thelma Schumacher's work. The performances are outstanding, especially from the child actors, and on a whole, it has an amazing, touching, and powerful look at faith and a very unique and almost peaceful atmosphere, despite and because of what the story is about. It's incredible, and you can barely find it anywhere, thanks to Disney. What you may not know is that this movie was made by Touchstone Pictures, and Disney owns Touchstone Pictures. And on top of that, Disney makes a lot, and I do mean a lot, of money in China. That's why if there's anything that doesn't work with China's extremely extensive censorship, it will only ever be in short seconds or arranged in a way that Disney can easily censor it or cut it out of their Chinese releases so they can make as much money as possible. It's a really scummy feeling practice when it comes to stuff like supporting gay rights, because on paper they say that they do, and they make their money off of pride pins and merchandising and even shows made by LGBTQ people, but we still have first on-screen gay character number 62, and a lot of stuff like Nimona getting dropped and Owl House getting cancelled, and just a lot of disingenuous behavior from a mega corporation who doesn't want anyone to be unhappy and who really wants to make a lot of money in China. But one thing that China was not super happy about was a film that showed the Tibetan perspective of what went down with their people. One that showed the accounts of atrocities they committed and the propaganda they spewed out about the Dalai Lama. Overall, it's a film that makes the Chinese look pretty bad, and the actual events the film is based on happened relatively recently. So Disney formally apologized for letting the film get made and stopped pretty much all production of the movie, and of course made it unavailable on streaming or renting, effectively trying to erase the fact that it exists, much like they did with their actual questionable history like Song of the South. There are still copies floating around places that you can buy, and you could still find it online some places, but it makes me super sad to see a film that clearly has this much love and care and craft put into it essentially poof out of existence. Especially a film directed by somebody who cares so much about film preservation like Scorsese. Watching the movie, I was kind of in awe of the scale that the movie has. The lavish sets and costumes, the massive scope of the movie. It feels like an important and big biographical film that highlights the good side of a faith and religion that is rarely portrayed that way in the US. So, yeah, if you can find it, watch it. Enjoy it. Remember it. Write about it. Don't let it disappear, because I think it definitely deserves to be remembered and shared and kept. Both the story and the work of art. I gave it, of course, a 5 out of 5. It seems kind of silly still doing these, being that you know what I gave all the rest of these. At number 9, Taxi Driver, 1976. We finally got to Taxi Driver, the really strong Scorsese movie from the 70s, which the 70s is like my favorite decade of movies, so you'd think I'd like more of his 70s movies, but again, it just goes to show you, usually you get better with time, but Taxi Driver is the exception. We're finally getting to some of the super duper well-known ones, the kind Ken would start explaining the subtleties to Barbie about. And yeah, what can I say, Taxi Driver is a really, really good movie. The film follows Travis, the worst person ever probably, played by De Niro, as he gets further indoctrinated into believing the worst things about almost everyone and dives deeper into his racist, misogynistic views until he feels compelled to, quote-unquote, clean up the streets, and he goes on a murderous rampage that the city then hails him for as you slowly realize how messed up the world is and want to personally die. So yeah, it's a cool film. Another, of course, Scorsese and De Niro picture about a creepy little guy delving into his worst, most delusional self. This time, with that lovely Paul Schrader flair of not just being unnerving and disturbing, which this definitely still is, but also bringing a really deep understanding and examination of the human spirit in its darkest and most isolated. In this instance, about men who force themselves into quote-unquote chronic loneliness until they're barely a human being, viewing everyone else but them and people they agree with as the problem. It ends similarly to its comedy-focused sister film, The King of Comedy, but this time without the irony or suggestion that it might simply be his delusion. This film doesn't let you go that easily. It has you sit with and watch from above as he makes each slow, almost aimless move. And I think what's fascinating about this compared to something like The King of Comedy is, whereas in that the outcome and message are simple and calculated, in this it's so much more distant and thoughtful towards the actions in the movie. It's not really at all what I expected from it tonally when I first went into it, especially with how popular it is among people with certain views. Kind of like American Psycho or Fight Club or even The Wolf of Wall Street in turn. But it turned out to be slow and contemplative and thoughtful, as a lot of Schrader films are, and it leaves me in this weird place where it's one of my favorites and yet least favorites to be in on the list, because the film is beautiful, the performances are outstanding, this is hands down the best score any Scorsese film has ever had. the only film to have a Bernard Herrmann score and his last score before passing away. But it twists it in every turn to the world that Travis sees, which is very engaging but unpleasant. And on top of that, this is the first film where Scorsese and co. seem to really have nailed it in filmmaking-wise for the early films. I mean, they made this in '76, and that is super impressive for a lot of reasons, and its 70s-ism makes it so much more atmospheric and unique, and it looks great, and it feels great, and it's so gross to be in. You kind of want to go take a shower after you've seen it, because it just feels like you've been dragged down into the sewer of New York. And I do find it really interesting that it's trying to say something important about this very real and dangerous group of men and what they believe. It's just, honestly, a really good film. I again gave it a 5 out of 5. At number 8, Shutter Island 2010. We're in the sparkly 2010s, baby. They're so shiny and overexposed. I don't have too much to say about Shutter Island. It's not the most personally impactful for me, and it's not the most special among Scorsese's work. But this one is like, well, it's like the inception of Scorsese's filmography. And not just because it has DiCaprio as its lead, or it was also released in 2010, but because it's just kind of perfect and fun, and really one that I would just turn on whenever, even if it's not my emotional cup of tea. It's got such an engaging and unique setting with great performances and a really solid mystery. And again, for almost everyone involved, this is one of those movies from them that I would just turn on anytime. I would show this to almost anyone. Like, this would be my go-to kind of comfort, like, pulpy Scorsese film. And on top of that, if we're diving further into the Inception comparison, it has a character posing as a cop or security of some kind to trick someone into thinking they're helping, and also DiCaprio questioning if his reality is real because of his dead wife, who he remains obsessed with, as he questions his reality through a seemingly mind-bending maze. So, yeah, it's definitely the inception of Scorsese's filmography. But there's also some really fun horror moments in this. Mark Ruffalo is really great in this as well, and I'm not usually a big fan of his, and this is just one of the few movies from Marty that feels so much like this dark mystery crime genre riff that I really love, set with trench coats and notepads and great hats, and a stormy island that everyone's trapped on. It just makes for so many memorable set pieces and twists and turns, and it builds up a really incredible atmosphere as you get deeper and deeper into the conspiracy. It's so much freaking fun and has some really poppy digital visuals, and I stand by my number 8 for it, even if I don't have too much personal connection to it, just because it really is a comfort Scorsese film for me. I gave it a 5 out of 5. You were probably wondering, but I can just clue you in on that. At number 7, Silence, 2016. There's a famous little anecdote about the fact that Scorsese almost became a Catholic priest instead of a filmmaker. You may be like, yeah, that makes sense, he's made a lot of films about religion, but on a much deeper level, almost all of Scorsese's films explore these ideas he carried with him, especially the ones with Paul Schrader, another filmmaker whose later career at least is interested in questioning the nature of religion and humanity and how they interact with one another. On the whole, I find Scorsese, despite me not always personally agreeing with him, to be one of the most thoughtful artists making religious movies I have ever seen. And nowhere, well, almost nowhere, is that more apparent than in Silence. Silence follows two priests, played by Andrew Garfield and Adam Driver, in the 17th century, going to Japan to try and spread their faith at a time where Japan had banned Catholicism as well as almost all foreign contact, and was about to forego its roots and become far more imperialistic Japan, as well as their quest to look for Father Ferreira, played by Liam Neeson, who went missing there previously. This movie is a freaking lot. It's long, it's got a lot of torture, and it never really gives you a chance to breathe, or smile, or feel good about anything. And it has such an interesting and thorough discussion of Catholicism, good and bad, and what it means to be a missionary or to share faith with someone who can't understand fully what you mean. It pulls no punches in coming after religion and standing up for faith, and highlights a lot of the troubling things that come out of Christianity and especially Catholicism, with Andrew Garfield's character being such a fascinating exploration of the Jesus complex that so many people get, and its questions on what God actually asks from us in this life, and what he asks us to endure for him. And of course, when it is a good time to be silent or to take a stand. This is a stone cold masterpiece, and I do mean stone cold. The ending is one of my favorites of any film I've ever seen, and the acting is incredible. Adam Driver and Andrew Garfield, and really everyone in this, blows it out of the water. And it has such hard things in it to watch that fully make the message and conversation feel so much more important and tangible, while never being so overblown, in your face, silly, and propagandistic, I think that's a word, that it makes it feel like you're sitting through 2 hours of torture porn like The Passion of Christ, which, oof, that's a whole other thing. The fact that this is at number 7 actually kind of blows my mind, and is really only this low because of technically how unpleasant it is at parts to watch, and how the ones above it mean even more to me, or I like even more. But it is one of the best movies I've seen touching on all the topics it's going for. It looks incredible, the editing and filmmaking and sets, and just everything are outstanding, and there's some real standout scenes that I haven't been able to get out of my head ever since I saw them. You should watch this film at least once in your life. Seriously, especially if you're religious, and especially if you're Christian or Catholic.
Come ahead now. It's all right. Step on me. I understand your pain. I was born into this world to share men's pain. I carried this cross for your pain. Your life is with me now. Step.
Hey guys, you wanna hear a secret? I gave Silence. I gave it a 5 out of 5. Coming in at number 6, we're getting to the real good ones. At number 6, After Hours, 1985. I don't know if that's correct. It's correct. This movie is something else, let me tell you. I mean, just look at the description on Letterboxd. An ordinary word processor has the worst night of his life after he agrees to visit a girl in Soho whom he met that evening in a coffee shop. That's all there is, and that's all this movie is. It falls under that lovely type of comedy that doesn't really get made anymore, where the main character just kind of wants to do one simple thing, in this instance go home, and no matter what they do, everything always goes wrong in increasingly over-the-top ways. It's essentially a screwball comedy if you look at it closely, and it's just so much fun to get a movie like this from Scorsese. The movie is bonkers and has this interesting feeling of dread and surrealism to it. Griffin Dunne plays the lead in this, and it's just so much fun to watch this man go through the entire range of human emotions as things get more and more extreme and out of hand. And really, the atmosphere this movie captures, the quote-unquote after-hours feel of the movie and the New York area, make you feel like you're in a real place. And it's open, but yet somehow inescapable. Like you've just descended into one of the circles of hell, and it just so happens to be Soho in the 80s. It's fantastic, and there are too many amazing side characters and individual jokes that I love to name them all.
You just scream out, "Surrender, Dorothy." That's all. Just surrender, Dorothy.
Wow.
but this is a standout in almost every way in Scorsese's career for me. It employs amazing imagery and a strong sense of focus and momentum despite its repetitive nature, and it never once feels boring. And really, by the end, you feel like you've watched a man live through the worst night anyone ever could. But don't worry, he finally made it back home just in time for work again. It's this amazing slap-in-the-face drug trip of wishing to get out of the mundane workplace and following your desires into all of the wrong places. It's just so good and so funny. And again, you should watch it. I gave it a 5 out of 5. At number 5, the first in our top 5, Raging Bull, 1980. There's something profound to me about rage. It's something that I personally have felt for a lot of my life without ever really having an explanation as to why. I actually made a whole short film titled Rage, exploring how that feeling affected me and made me feel far before I ever watched this movie. But one thing it always left me with was this profound sense of sadness. Lonely, regretful sadness. Whether I did or said stuff I shouldn't, or in some circumstances broke something or ruined something that could never be made the same. It's hard to explain the stuff you do when you feel rage, and it's a tragic story for anyone who's afflicted by it or the people around them. I say all this to say that Raging Bull is a film that hits a lot of personal fears and topics for me. As someone who growing up would get so angry for seemingly no reason to even me personally, and would fight and would break things. Although I've gotten a lot better now and haven't gotten like that in a long time, it always sits there in the back of my mind as a fear that I might. Whenever I freak out over something not making sense to me or something that I think is unfair, I think about what and where that anger will take me. And there's no film with a more tragic and real feeling portrayal of what that sad and scary existence is than Raging Bull. The film follows Jake LaMotta, a champion boxer played by De Niro, as he rises in his career along with the helps of his brother Joey, played by Joe Pesci, and his relationship with his wife Vicky. And it follows as he rises as a boxer and the way his relationships and people skills start to get increasingly worse. One of the most interesting and unique things about this movie is the fights. They're haunting and slow, and you find that Jake's rage isn't expressed inherently in his fights. I mean, it is, but not in a direct way. In the fighting, he's almost the most peaceful you see him in his rage. He has a clear target, an enemy. All he has to do is take the pain and push through and take out the target. But that's not always the same for the people around him he interacts with. He's paranoid and depressed, and he takes that out into thinking the worst about everyone around him, making every single person his personal enemy. And as things go on, his verbal abuse of his wife and family go to physical abuse, as he with scary precision goes into these rages where he locks onto his target and creates new enemies to get through. It's genuinely a really, really unpleasant film to watch, as Jake's abuse is extremely vile and coarse verbally, and almost horrifying in its intensity and physicality. You see him struggle with the inability to be happy with the things around him and the people around him, blaming everything and everyone else but himself, until the toll and true underlying sadness of his life leads him to push everyone around him away and hurt every single one of them. His inability to be happy with being the best in his weight class leads him to destroy his own body to try and become the heavyweight champion, and by the end of the movie, you're left with the shell of a broken and empty man who can barely be recognized as the man we spent the rest of the film with. The black and white of the film not only symbolizing the way Jake views the world, but also allowing the visuals to highlight the actors' performances and visually striking lighting, creating a unique and oppressive atmosphere that when it gets a break for even a moment in the movie, you see for a brief time, for once in his whole life, Jake could be happy, even if he ruins it soon after. It's just heartbreaking. I think this is some of Pesci and De Niro's most unique feeling performances among their work with Scorsese, and it's one of the films that personally means the most to me out of this list. And its exploration of a broken and rage-filled soul is so complex and tragic that it just feels like the perfect blend of Scorsese and Schrader's style. I gave it, of course, a 5 out of 5. At number 4, 10 years later, we have Goodfellas, 1990. Just literally like the greatest movie ever, probably, so you don't even need to listen to the rest of what I have to say. You can just skip ahead on the YouTube bar a couple seconds. This one is much less personal than Raging Bull. It's freaking Goodfellas, one of the best gosh darn movies to ever freaking get made. Goodfellas, as you hopefully know, follows our lovely trio of buddies played by Joe Pesci, Robert De Niro, and the one and only Ray Liotta. This thing is a giant of cinema. It's like the defining movie for Scorsese for me. It's super fun, it's got the amazing use of voiceover that so few people can pull off, and while it's not used quite as much as Casino, it keeps the pacing moving like a bullet, while also being a great way to get us a lot of natural feeling exposition and character work straight from the mouth of monologuing Mr. Henry Hill. Like, what can I say? Every scene in this movie is just perfect and iconic and fun. Ray Liotta is such a joy to watch in this role. It's literally one of my favorites, if not my single favorite performance in all of these movies. It's electric and exciting and then manic and dangerous, and yet he conveys so much of the dangerous charm and emotion that makes him such a compelling lead that a woman might even fall in love with despite asking him to hide a gun for her after beating a man with it. This movie understands in general how to use violence. The opening of the movie immediately sets you up for the kind of adventure this is going to be, and it's violence as a symbol and as a drug. Henry always wanted to be a gangster because it made you important. In his mind, the violence, the dirty money, the drugs, the risk, it all is what made life worth living for him and what made him feel like a person. But like any drug, it takes its toll. It starts to eat him from the inside out, like a parasite. His life starts to fall apart, and in the end, he tries to pull clean. And he does. He sells everyone out and gets away, but he is always thinking about that life, the violence, and how everything was for the taking. And now it's over. It's such a powerful ending for the character who we've watched for 3 hours be a kind of not great guy, but yet be so fun to watch, because you can really kind of get infected with him. By the end, you want the suits and the cars and the violence to continue, but it doesn't. It's so freaking good, and it's an all-timer from Joe Pesci for sure. The "you really are a funny guy" scene I still reference all the time, and it's just so good.
What? You're funny. You mean, so? Well, let me understand this, because maybe it's me, I'm a little fucked up, maybe. But I'm funny how? I mean, funny like I'm a clown, I amuse you? I make you laugh? I'm here to fucking amuse you? What do you mean funny? Funny how? How am I funny?
And his death scene, and Robert De Niro in this is really fun, and this is just, in general, probably one of my go-to movies, right next to, again, Shutter Island for ones that I would just turn on anytime with any person. It is an incredible movie, and it is so much fun. I gave it a 5 out of 5. At number 3, we have The King of Comedy, 1982. Am I right? The King of Comedy is just one of those films you really have to see to get it. And no, watching Joker doesn't count. It's just a particular brand of engrossing, disturbing, and honestly funny that is hard to quantify. It's one of the best, most personally disturbing thrillers I've ever seen, and yet it's PG, and really the biggest threat of violence is a girl with a fake gun, and yet it taps into a different kind of violence, a psychological and really sociological violence. You know, like Black Mirror those 2 times it was really good. This film, particularly for people working in show business at the time, was so personally disturbing and almost embarrassing and took such a toll on the actors that Martin Scorsese wouldn't work with Robert De Niro, who originally pitched the idea and worked on the story for 7 years after the production of the movie. The concept was simple enough. They would take all of the bad and creepy, and sometimes violent encounters that all of these performers had actually experienced, and boil it down into this horror story of a mediocre man obsessed to the point of madness with a man that he believes can give him the chance to break out into show business just like him. And then it boils over into an act of true violence when he doesn't get what he thinks he deserves for being such a loyal fan. And at the end of the day, this atrocious behavior fuels his rise to legitimate success. And it so deeply and thoroughly explores this parasocial relationship people have with celebrities even back in the 80s that it just becomes this fascinating, anxiety-inducing, and honestly funny trip into what even Marty considered to be Robert De Niro's best performance under his direction. De Niro disappears into the role of Rupert Pupkin, creating such an interesting character. To quote Silent Dawn on Letterboxd, since he put it more eloquently than I could, it feels pure, mainly when the character decides to watch Rupert Pupkin in all his mesmerizing and terrifying glory, both hilarious and creepy. De Niro embodies this complex character with glorious quirkiness and a sense of childish playfulness. In particular, the scenes involving Rupert and his unseen mother are painstakingly funny and weird in their uncertainty. And on top of that, Jerry Lewis and Diane Abbott are both outstanding and just as memorable on screen. Lewis especially, as they could really tap into a lot of personal things for him, both grabbing from real interactions he had with fans and working with De Niro, a method actor, for the first time, pulling out some spikes of real anger from Lewis. It's got all the filmmaking feels and charms of Taxi Driver, even nailing in the "this is such a good commentary, it's actually scary how real these things have become," while taking on a much more clinical and mysterious role. There are so many all-timer scenes throughout this, and I am never bored. It's paced like a bullet, shot like a nightmarish dream, edited so snappily that you'd think it was a slap bracelet clinching you with the almighty power of the "let me show you my pride and joy" joke.
Let me show you a picture of my pride and joy.
This is genuinely one of the best movies I've ever seen, and one of my all-time favorites. I could literally do an entire video on this movie and not cover all of the amazing things that went into it, or that the story itself touches on. Even looking back on it, writing this and looking at footage editing this has made me want to stop what I'm doing and go watch the movie again, which is what you should do, but like, do it once the video is over, you're close to the end, and you don't want to leave now. You'll miss the epic mystery of which order the final two will be in. But yeah, I could go on and on and on about the corporate look of the movie and the use of lighting during the fantasy scenes and the use of color throughout and the costuming, and someone needs to tie me to my chair with a bunch of tape because I'm never going to stop writing about this movie.
Better to be king for a night than schmuck for a lifetime.
I, of course, gave it a 5 out of 5. I need to stop saying "of course." I'm sure that's getting kind of tiresome. At number 2, we have The Aviator, 2004. This one also means a lot to me personally. And we're also at the final 2, so if you know your Scorsese, or you paid attention at the beginning of the video, you probably know what the number 1 slot is. Now, some may be questioning at this point how 2 movies top the king of comedy for me, and I may question that myself sometimes, but it boils down to that Raging Bull situation where films mean a lot to me personally, and I think they're honestly just as solid as the king of comedy, but yet affect me in unique ways that no other film have. Which brings us to the number 2 of the whole 25, The Aviator. The Aviator is a biopic following the life of airplane pioneer, movie-interested womanizer, and genuinely struggling man, Howard Hughes. One of the major things it explores is Howard Hughes' struggle with extreme OCD in a time before anyone knew what that was or how to begin to help with it. And really, one thing that makes me really sad is seeing most people's reaction to this movie. I know it personally impacted me a lot, which I'll get into in a second, but for most of my friends, and for most of the top reviews, this movie just didn't really click for them. The open-endedness approach it takes to Hughes' life from beginning to end, or the style and the editing didn't work for them, or they didn't get the purpose of the movie, and that just really bums me out, because despite everything else, I truly believe this is an achievement of Scorsese cinema. It's a shiny and maximalist and overblown and blown out and overwhelming film. You see the forming of an egotistical giant who creates unimaginable flying machines and insanely expensive or bound-pushing movies, paired with the birth of a man struggling to simply feel okay with anything in his life, who struggles to connect meaningfully with anything but his work, something he can pour into with careful precision. You see him get stretched thinner and thinner as his and the people around him's ambition grow bigger than even the biggest plane to ever fly could hold. It's almost mythological in nature, which has no better fit than that very plane being called the Hercules. It contains some of my favorite visual flares and style, some of my favorite editing, my favorite DiCaprio performance, and my favorite Cate Blanchett performance until Tar, and one of the few things it did to me that no other movie ever has was make me feel anxious, make me squirm and twitch, and feel a way that I tried to bury for a lot of my life, or could just push to the back of my mind. Now, I hadn't fully realized it when I first watched this movie, and I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was that made me attached to this story, when hopefully I'm not really much like Howard Hughes, this genuinely creepy predator kind of not great guy. What I didn't know when I watched it for the first time, I now have quite a bit of an understanding around. That my brain doesn't quite work like everyone else's. Now, I'm not OCD by any means. If you take one look at, well, anything about me or my room or my stuff, you can tell that. But what I did find out is that I am definitely neurodivergent. I have dyslexia and might also be on the spectrum, still figuring things out with that, and these things and quirks that have affected me my whole life that I didn't always notice, like the weird way I was with social boundaries, or speaking to my friends in a way that I didn't think was rude but definitely was, that ended up making me lose lots of friends, or the weird things I do where if it's been a bit I feel like I can't drink out of the same cup of water I had, or the fact that the vacuum inexplicably hurt my ears, or that candles make me feel like I'm dying, and the list goes on of things I never particularly put my finger on, but were always there. And this movie captured to a scary degree some of the ways I personally felt, how I experienced some parts of the world. For the first time, I think ever, I felt like a movie understood the overwhelming and weird things I felt sometimes, that especially have gotten worse recently. There are things this movie does with its editing that some people have called sloppy, and that makes me really sad because they were particular tricks that got directly into my head. The use of audio editing to make sounds repeat multiple times, and the overwhelming nature of the lights in the movie and the way things are shot made me honestly get kind of overwhelmed the first time I watched the movie. I mean, that dinner scene is genuinely one of the hardest things for me to watch, and yet it feels so tangible and real.
I must admit some rather unique design features. You see, it has these two booms.
Letty built a birdhouse once. You remember that, dear?
Yes, well, a mere trifle, darling.
Oh, I remember the painting. The painting, it's called May 18 or something. Anyway, Goya's vastly overrated.
All the Spaniards are.
Nonsense. Picasso is sacred.
I'm a urologist.
It was quite aesthetic, really.
A sacred monster, that's what Picasso is.
The birds didn't care for it much, but the bats do.
I'll bet.
Oh, that's such...
Oh, speak up, dear.
Nothing, Mrs. Hepburn, nothing.
Then why did you speak?
And maybe that's a silly reason to love the film so much, when Howard was really not a great guy in a lot of ways. It's just a film that feels like it jumps into my head, and is also a very overwhelming and beautiful, tragic story of an amazing innovation and a triumphant defeat. It's dark and gripping and beautiful and fun and exciting and amazingly paced for one of the longest entries of the list, and the first movie to ever really make me stop and question stuff about how my personal brain and life worked, and the first Scorsese movie that really clicked for me, that when I watched it, which it was one of the first Scorsese films I watched, that I felt I genuinely needed to watch more of what this guy had to offer. And I hope there are other people out there who were able to connect with what it was doing, even with how unconventional and stilted it can be. And I hope there are other people who truly love The Aviator like I do. I gave The Aviator a 5 out of 5. This movie does not get the respect it deserves. And of course, that leaves only one movie. One that is pretty controversial among especially the sphere I grew up in. We have The Last Temptation of Christ, 1988. These last two movies are a lot to talk about. It's taken me a long time to even find the words to sit down and write about them. They both personally mean so much to me, and I feel like that might take away from some of my time that I probably should be talking about aspects of them more critically or have a more critical view on the movie on a whole, but what the heck. I would rather make a million videos about something that means a lot to me than just something that I think is perfect, something that speaks to me. And with this film, I have a lot of baggage even just getting through the door. As I've talked about many times on my channel, I am a Christian. I've grown up that way, and I'm not always proud of being Christian for reasons I'm sure you're all painfully aware of, but to cut away a lot of the more pressing and genuinely dangerous ones, since I don't have time to unpack all of that, one of the biggest things that bums me out is Christians' relationship to art, or rather the lack thereof, quite frankly, in recent times. I don't want to get all preachy here or anything, but one of the most beautiful parts of believing in a God, to me personally, and especially what I personally believe about God, is the relationship between God and art. This is something Judaism has down really well, along with a lot of other stuff. But knowing that I am created, and that I was given the ability to create, to express, and to communicate with God about humanity through art, is one of the most special feelings to me. I think there's a bit of God in pretty much all art because of this. And yet, despite this being one of the cornerstones of my personal views and faith, it seems like Christians have lost the plot a bit when it comes to making and engaging with art. I'm not sure most of them even know what media literacy is. But because I've grown up Christian in the Southern Bible Belt and also been interested in film, I had always heard of this film. This rather hated and quote-unquote sacrilegious film that was objectively trying to ruin the image of Christ and all of Christianity, probably. Because again, the way Christians interact with the media that they slightly disagree with is not pretty. This film is, of course, The Last Temptation of Christ, based on the book by the same name, carrying the same controversy. It is a Greek book published in 1952 and translated into English in 1960, following a fictional version of Jesus and the biblical story of his life as an experiment in faith on the behalf of the author, who claims to have been struggling with the idea of Jesus his entire life. This fully God, yet fully man thing that is the catalyst of the Christian faith, who screamed and shouted for peace and love as the solution, but yet led what was considered at the time to be a dangerous religious revolution, or at least the threat of one. A man who was supposedly one with God, yet cried out in such anguish and agony that blood streamed from his eyes. A man quite literally of contradictions, that led to a religion full of contradictory and hypocritical people. His book attempted not to actually fill in the blanks of Jesus' life, but imagine for the sake of thought what his life outside of the accounts of Scripture could have been, what the 30 years of his life as a normal human before he started his ministry were like, what his relationships and human desires were actually like, and most of all focusing on one of the most interesting portions of the story that gets glanced over, the temptations of Jesus. Now bear with me, I swear I will say something remotely interesting about the actual movie, but one of the biggest, I think, oversights of the way people read the Bible, especially Jesus' story, is how literally they take so much of the text, and yet how much they stretch over other things to fit ideas and concepts. And one of the weirder instances of this is the way this temptation is always portrayed in traditional Christian media. That Jesus just stoically stands there and says no immediately to all of the temptation. In fact, so many interpretations of Jesus are so stoic and bland, it's honestly incredible. There's no ability to read to the fact that Jesus might have actually, been tempted, that, he was fully man. So the book, focusing mainly around this, takes it a step further by asking what if Jesus was tempted again just before the cross. Tempted with something that, again, theoretically, he might have given into. the idea that God was sparing him from the pain of dying on the cross, that like Abraham, God was simply testing his willingness and he could choose to walk away to a simple life, being able to love and have children and exist in the true beauty of God's world that he wasn't able to before with the terrible weight of sacrifice hanging over him. Again, this is the man who didn't want to die on the cross so bad he was crying blood. That is in the Bible. But this thought experiment that very much advertises itself as an experiment was so controversial that it built up a huge amount of outrage from Christians who screamed, "How dare they show Jesus wanting sex and love? Don't you know that the Bible says, or at least my pastor says, that sex is evil? No, I don't know why he's showing so much interest in my young daughter. Why do you ask? Song of Solomon doesn't exist, and if it does, it's a metaphor, guys, I swear, because my wife has never been as happy as they described in that book." If you can tell, I'm a little sour over this. But this same controversy would follow as the hit director of such Christian family favorites as Taxi Driver, After Hours, and Raging Bull would be helming an adaptation of it to the silver screen. He would make a massive production hearkening to the times of Hollywood biblical epics, with Willem Dafoe as Jesus, Harvey Keitel as Judas, Barbara Hershey as Mary Magdalene, freaking Andre Gregory as John the Baptist for some reason, bringing his messed up little religious freak friend Paul Schrader with him to do the screenplay, and getting Michael Ballas, one of the greatest cinematographers to ever live, to shoot the movie. It would be 3 hours long with a massive budget and huge sets and lavish costumes and music. It truly was epic. And it would, of course, carry the controversial elements of the book. This time, of course, even worse, because we'd see it with our eyes. And we know the eyes are never to blame, but the things that we see with the eyes and then the thoughts we think about them, that's also to blame of the things we see. Anyway, I've got a lot of tangents I want to go off on, but I'm trying to keep this brief. But what this simple and quite frankly sad and reactionary view of media that questions even the slightest status quo, even though it technically agrees with your views, or has some content that might be a little questionable, though even the nudity and sex in the movie, despite being very present, are usually done in a pretty historically accurate and quote-unquote tasteful way, but this mindset makes them lose out on what I honestly think is one of the single most powerful pieces of religious art I've ever experienced, and what I think is the only display of Jesus in a work of art outside of the Bible that actually makes me feel like he was real. Whereas most movies are too scared to make Jesus anything more than a collection of quotes, or doing whatever The Chosen is doing, which is fine, but for the little I watched the show, it just never really clicked for me. Jesus is this untouchable, unrelatable, non-human thing, and this film breaks that barrier simply by not trying to be accurate, but by telling you straight up, this is not meant to replace or to be the Gospels, and letting him instead be human, with wants and desires and conflicts and mistakes, who grapples with his own nature, who can't even fully understand what is God and what isn't in his head, who tries to lead a group despite not knowing what his message will be till it escapes his lips, and someone who wants to get out of one of the worst ways you could die. And the ending portion of the movie is simply incredible. The reality-bending section when Jesus chooses not to die on the cross, the fact that the religion still goes on without him, the scene with Paul, the destruction of the world, and the regret and guilt Jesus carries is incredible, making the scene where he begs inches away from death to go back and die in that awful, shameful, painful way out of love and fear and true bravery, and then gets taken back and is allowed to try again, one of the most powerful in any movie I've ever watched, and the only piece of media that feels like it truly understands how Jesus, even in the Bible, ticks as a person, and why that sacrifice is so meaningful beyond just, oh, this perfect God-man briefly dies on the cross so everyone is saved now, yay. It's brilliant, and so many people are not just missing out on that, but actively condemning the movie with that message. It's terribly tragic, especially given the state of art they will associate with. This film is a true monument of Scorsese's career, in my opinion. His religious roots and grapplings, his outstanding direction and use of abstract filmmaking this time around, his dialogue and the performances he gets out of these actors. It's Paul Schrader's best movie next to maybe Mishima, and it's probably his most emotional and solid overall script. It's a massive achievement and victory lap even so early on for Thelma Schoonmaker. Willem Dafoe is the quintessential Jesus, and the rest of the cast, especially Harvey, excels in the movie, despite them all being historically inaccurate and very, very Italian sounding, which leads to very funny line deliveries.
I'm you. I'm your heart. Your heart is so greedy. It pretends to be humble, but it really wants to conquer the world.
It is just the Martin Scorsese picture, in my opinion, and also tackles very personally powerful and empowering topics that I think deserve to be given a far more fair shot by Christians especially. It is everything that made me fall in love with Scorsese's films. The style, the thoughtfulness, the editing, the pacing, the performance, the love for the craft, the love for faith. And I hope if you made it to the end of this list, or just the end of me talking about this movie, you'll take some time to check out the world of these extremely talented artists. I gave The Last Temptation of Christ a 5 out of 5, plus like all of my heart. I think there's something on this list for everyone, and even when the films aren't for you, I think there's really interesting things that can be explored in them artistically. Scorsese isn't the end-all of directors. He doesn't only make masterpieces, and his words, views, and opinions aren't all there is, but I think he's someone at least worth hearing out, even if you disagree or dislike it, much like The Last Temptation itself. So yeah, thank you, Marty, and all of the incredibly talented people who brought to life these movies. That movie, and most of the movies in the top half, means so much to me. These films have affected my life in a lot of ways, including how I've made this channel, and how I view other movies, and just my personal emotional self. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed. I hope you enjoyed seeing my face. Maybe you didn't. Maybe you thought my face was ugly and I should go back to all voiceover. Maybe I will. That's kind of mean. But I've been wanting to try out being on video quite a bit lately, and I finally took the time to kind of tweak my setup a little bit. Who knows, if this works and I like it, I may do this more. I may have more fancy stuff and outfits and fun things, because I like that kind of stuff. I think it's fun. That's why I wanted to do a face cam. But if it doesn't work well, you'll never see my face again, and you have no proof that this is me. This is voiceover right now. I'm not really talking. But thanks again for watching. Shout out to Robbie Grayway for all of the support, including this very studio I'm in, this microphone, that light, not the camera, that's my camera, that computer over there, and really just a huge thanks to Robbie all around. I would not be able to do this channel without him. He also designed the thumbnail. Check out the link in the description to see his website. He does freelance work. You could get a nice thumbnail from him, so you should do that. And I'll see you guys hopefully next month. I know this took 2 months, but it's been crazy. I'm trying to figure out stuff for a student visa so I can go study abroad. Lots of things going on, but I hope you guys enjoyed, and hopefully I'll still be able to do this channel consistently. I love doing it, and I love all of you, every single one of you, and Martin Scorsese, if you're watching, I love you too.
It's been an hour. It's under S. Under S. Oh. How could I have done this? It doesn't make any sense. Look at it. There's no life to it at all. Oh, my nephew. Say cheese. Good direction, Marty. Here, this one, interesting. It's far too nostalgic. What do you think?
It's pretty.
Composition is forced, lighting is bad, angle is off. Too literal, too violent, too metaphorical, too dark. Here, we have the protagonist, but where's the antagonist? Huh? Where's the drama? Unavoidable. Gotta reshoot. Yeah, Timmy, that's your Uncle Marty. How'd you like to turn 5 again?